Thank you so much for making yourselves available today. This is part of our Executive Series Symposium, which is geared towards an intimate gathering such as this. And we hear about a particular topic that may concern us in the property industry itself. Today we've got Mark Dawson from Urbis. He leads the research arm, and in particular the residential focus at Urbis here in Melbourne. And he'll present some of his findings in terms of the, what's happening in the market and the future trends in terms of what he's observing and what he's identifying through his research. Now, with this, just think of this as more of a roundtable discussion. It is being recorded, but however, if there's anything sensitive, we will not upload that video publicly. We'll keep that in-house. So it is, you can consider this as Chatham House rules as well, if required. Okay. So Mark is a director at Urbis. He leads about a team, about a dozen or so, I think.
Let's make up a number.
Let's make a number. That's about it. So I mean, obviously, Urbis has been doing quite a fair bit of research in the residential space. They've released a number of reports in terms of your findings, in terms of both the costings and the how the residential market's facing, in particular in this Melbourne market as we're going through, and hopefully some forecasts in terms of what the trends are happening through the marketplace and how we can help our clients to. What's that sector? Oh, sure. It's all good. Thanks. And obviously help with that work. So Mark, if you want to take it away.
Great, thanks Phil, and thanks all for coming. I'll probably start with just extending I's introduction. A lot of this presentation is going to be based off our Apartment Essentials recurring publication that we do quarterly. For some reason, I don't know why, I've adopted a nautical theme throughout this presentation. I don't sail, I do love the water, but we've ended up with a lot of weather, and it just seemed quite topical as we try and make sense of it all and work out how the prevailing conditions, let us look forward. So, you'll see a few random references. You'll be cringing. You're thinking, dad jokes throughout, but that's just me, unfortunately.
That's a good start, though.
Yeah, that's probably. They say start with your best work, and I should probably go. But quick run through of what I plan to talk about today. What we do, why we do it, some insights from the last 12 months, a quick run through of the things that are sort of up against us at the moment in terms of headwinds, the things that we're not quite sure about how they're going to pan out yet. They seem like challenges now, and we haven't quite worked through what will happen. So the crosswinds, the tailwinds that fundamentally keep us going, being in Melbourne in a great place, and then what to make of it all. What are the survival tips for the next few months as we work through some of these things, and then hopefully we have a couple of drinks and forget about it. So, the Urbis Essentials publication, it's very much a report that's by the industry for the industry. So we survey developers directly on a quarterly basis. We typically get detailed project information from about a third to a quarter of the market every quarter in terms of the detailed individual sales by size, price, how many are sold in the development, what's the overhang, and so on. On top of that, we do the supply situation, what are the approvals coming through, what's the status of them, and breaking that down so that you don't just look at that huge number over there and panic. You say, okay, let's be realistic about that. How is that broken down, and what does that mean in the short term, medium term, and what sort of levers will be pulled to influence that. So what do we cover? I mean, this report, obviously there's a much bigger apartment market than this, but the biggest concentration in the last couple of years has been in this sort of inner area. We're running from St Kilda in the south to Brunswick in the north, Flemington in the west to Armidale in the east, and we're expanding it for the next edition to cover a wider area, and we'll continue to grow. But what does this coverage give us? It gives us off the plan weighted average price of about 715,000 in the last survey we did, which was an increase on the previous quarter, believe it or not. So that continuing to tick along, and demand from a purchaser point of view continues to be the most popular product across the board consistently, 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom product. Though there is some variation by precinct. In the price variation, you're getting about an 8 or 9% premium in the inner east and inner south, and usually the central precinct it dipped a bit below in the last quarter, and the more affordable ones being the inner north, where there tends to be a bit more sort of student-focused investor stock, and the inner west, which is probably skewed by the smaller number of projects. Like I said, from a sales perspective, 2-bed, 2-bathrooms have been the hero throughout this. We've been doing it for about 5 or 6 consecutive quarters now. They've consistently been the most commonly sold product. But on the flip side, when you talk to the leasing agents, the 1-bedrooms are flying out the door. So you've got this sort of dual dynamic going on of sales popularity and rental popularity. So we might just have to think about, when push comes to the shove in the long term, how do we address some of those differences? Price per square metre, like I said, prices have been consistently trending upwards. I remember doing the first one in Q4 2014, and we had a weighted average price of under 600,000, I think, and we're up to 715 for the last one. Across the product types, we've been creeping up, generally upwards. You see the higher rates per square metre in the bigger product, but that's probably as much a function of the scarcity of it in that area, as well as you put your biggest and your best product with the best views in the corner and everything else, and so it's not just a product factor, it's all things considered, and you all know this. And then we come to the purchaser demand side. So we hear a lot about supply and how much is in the market selling, under construction, and all the rest of it. When it comes to sales, a lot of that has already sold, right? So if you think we surveyed 50 projects out of about 169 that were active at the time, accounting for our survey sample was about 10,000 apartments overall. 82% of those projects had already sold, and the average absorption in the CBD of the last year or so had been about 5 to 15% per month of 1 and 2 bedroom stock had been taken up, showing really healthy levels of sales. And a lot of people have done very well to motor through the sales, and now they're worrying, okay, what does this mean when it comes to actually delivering this stuff and settlement? But we've come to a sort of temporary blip, if you like, in confidence on the back of this media storm around settlement and supply and all the rest of it. Whereas we've been going through and saying, sales are there, there's a lot of confidence in and interest in buying. I think, with the exception of the current quarter that we're surveying, we're about halfway through, I think we'll see some mixed results, because people will be saying, there's all this stuff going on that's just making purchasers sit back and say, I just don't know how this is going to pan out. But on the flip side, you've got projects that are completely isolated from it. If you think about the difference between something that's really reliant on furb sales in the CBD, and then you take something like a luxury project in East Melbourne that's everybody in your office is asking, my cousin, my brother wants to buy that project, do you know anything about it? It's like, well, who doesn't? You're asking me, so. and they'll probably break the records for the price per square metre on what they've delivered. A bit of a temporary blip in the confidence going on, but let's see whether that rebounds after the impacts of the election, after things start to wash through, and I'll touch on a few other things shortly as well. These headwinds that I'm talking about, what are they? It's consistently the supply. You take that 93,000 headline number of apartments in that in that concentrated area that I'm talking about, potential supply, and you say, wow, that's big, that's new. And you look how it's skewed to the central area. But let's break it down a bit, and you say, okay, what's under construction, the blue, much smaller proportion. What's in pre-sales, the purple, much smaller proportion. Even the approved stuff, a fair bit of approvals have come through in that most recent quarter after a slowdown last year. And then the rest, a big chunk remains in application. Who knows when, who knows what, how, and what it will look like. So that big number comes back, and I'll come back to this a bit later when we assess the, what does the supply and demand balance look like. It looks very different depending which one you compare it to. And as you can see, concentrated, you've got the red ones, dots on the right on the map that are in application, the yellow that are approved, and the green that are in pre-sales, and you can see the clusters of activity pretty clearly, and no surprises, a big cluster around the uni, big clusters around train stations and along transport corridors, and generally where you're getting large-scale swathes of land that come forward and are going to be rejuvenated at large scale. But again, it comes back to timing. So we'll revisit this a bit later on, but no one's denying that there's a lot of potential supply out there, but what does it mean? Let's relate to it and try and work out in the big picture what needs to happen to deliver it and when can we actually absorb that amount of stock. So, the headwinds, we talked about this sort of settlement issue at the moment. So it seems to be the buzzword of everybody at these points. And for me, it comes down to a sort of short-term speed ramp, if you like, that we haven't quite worked how to get over and how quickly we can get over. So we've got, the combined pincer movement, if you like, of your overseas capital controls, your taxes on foreign investment, your lending restrictions are the main one. That's, all of those things are leading to reassessing risk, putting downward pressure on valuations, and some of you were talking about this before we started. Those interim options to try and bridge the gap between that initial loan that you thought you had are currently punitive in the rates that are being offered, and that all of that is being communicated across your global market of demand. So those agents that were selling in China are now saying, please give us some good news, because we're reading the papers and seeing that this is, we can't borrow, we're not welcome. It's not necessarily the case at all, but sells papers here. On the plus side, there's huge demand for the reasons that we're all familiar with to live and invest in a place like Australia and in Melbourne. I was one of those people a few years ago that said, I'm pretty sick and tired of living in the grotty doldrums of London, beavering away on the tube. I'm thinking of a better life. There are people that have had a far worse life than me, but are just as able to make this move and choose Australia and Melbourne as a place to live and invest. And I'm pretty sure at some point in the near future, somebody is going to bridge this gap and help people settle. So there'll be a few delays, and I won't be surprised if a few projects are sort of 99.9% complete for the next few months, and construction's conveniently held up, and all sorts of things to be flexible, to find ways to help people settle, and all sorts of things. And even from a sales point of view, we've heard about people getting onto it earlier and being a bit more cautious with their sales, and also even replacing some of them. So this is before you get to settlement, more on the sales side early on. But a few things we think will wash out and start to even up the balance, even if there's a subdued re-increase in, that's not really a word, but a subdued increase in activity back towards previous levels. I think it will improve, and that confidence will start to come back once that gap is bridged. So, we've talked about headwinds. There are some things that people will probably say, well, headwinds, but for me, I'm not exactly sure how some of these will work out yet, and I'll touch upon that shortly. So I've called them crosswinds for now, because I haven't quite figured it out. Two things here, from a planning perspective, is the Better Apartments guidelines, but also the C270 amendment. So C270 has obviously tried to readdress the balance, particularly in the CBD, about pushing back into favour commercial floor space, away from being overtaken by residential. Whether it actually does that or not, I think the jury's out, because some of the practicalities of it, the floor plates that are required for commercial don't actually necessarily work under some of the metrics they're currently assessing that, is my understanding. So in some cases you could actually end up undermining your intentions and pushing things back in favour of taller, thinner residential towers. But for me, it's at least the intention is to try and clamp down and readjust the level of activity in favour of commercial. So that could go either way. It's either a headwind or a crosswind or whatever you want to call it. As is the Better Apartments intervention that has been on the agenda for a while, and it's becoming more and more concrete by the day. So when this first started to get talked about this time last year, or maybe a bit before, we suddenly saw a slowdown in the volume of approvals coming forward because of uncertainty. So whenever you introduce something that people haven't figured out yet, it has an impact while people try and work it out, particularly from a decision maker's point of view, approving or rejecting things. You're not even sure, and you haven't got the confidence until big boss over there signs it off. And then, do we even know what that decision-making process looks like? We don't. Does it get to a point where you say, oh, that one was approved, that sort of looks similar, so I think I'll approve that one too. Or this one looks a bit different, so I'm not sure, it might take a bit longer. Might be better design, might fit all those principles, but who's making that decision and how long does it take? So I think this will add to some of the timelines, particularly in the short term, as it did last year, where it'll slow down some of those approvals. Now, a lot of people have talked about the increased cost. If you're even feasibility from the outset. So if your setback requirements are substantially increased, some of those sites maybe they're not workable. Those get shelved, get parked, get reworked. Again, complex decision making involved can push those back a period of time. The costs of nobody particularly liked the idea of apartments with ceiling heights like this and no daylight whatsoever. But adding in these restrictions obviously has an impact on your total yield, how workable some of the sites are, even potentially, if you've got restrictions about the depth of apartment, I don't know how attractive they are anyway. So, that's from an architect's point of view, it's probably one to talk through a bit more on that. But for me, I see that from an economics point of view being an intervention which will slow down the process and intervene on the volume of supply that comes forward. So increased costs, reduced yield, timelines pushing out will impact upon supply to some degree. So what's keeping us afloat? What's pushing us along? Pretty obvious things.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've amended the title.
So not biased.
But again, I don't know what we'll do when we come second. But for the fifth, sixth consecutive year, I forget what it is now. Sixth, there you go. Everybody's quite proud of it and wants to retain it. So it's good that you're buying into it.
You must get an honorary awesome title after 6 goes at it, surely.
Yeah, well, let's put it up there and make the case, right? And 92, just under 92,000 people moved to Melbourne last year. So you're getting faster rates of growth in Melbourne than you are in other capital cities in Australia. You're getting a lot of people that continue to want to come here for the lifestyle, the jobs, the education, everything it has to offer. It actually gets a bit of global profile now that it never used to get from the events that are portrayed around the world, and also even this ranking system. People email me that I used to work with in London and say, "Oh, you made the right decision." Yeah, I know. So let's not forget all the good things that are underpinning creating good places and places that people want to live in. People are talking about this supply and the impact on rent, where a rent is going to come from and everything else. You'd expect vacancy rates to be going up and rents to be going down and everything else. Rents have been pretty flat, to be fair, but vacancy rates have come down. And there's actually a real difference between rents you're getting from your average market and your new product. So I'll explain this chart here. We did 10 case study buildings in the CBD of Docklands recently, all completed within the last 2 years. And we looked at what rents they were getting per week by product type compared to the average for those suburbs. And you can see you're getting an extra $40 a week in these new buildings for 1 bedrooms, an extra $33 for 2 bedroom, and an extra, it's pretty minimal for the 3 bedrooms. That might just be a sample size issue, I don't know. Not a huge part of the market. And again, from a percentage point of view, the premiums ranging from 10% for your 1 bedrooms, about 6-7% for your 2 bedrooms. So you're getting actually tower hoppers who will rent in the newest building and then they'll move into the newest building. And SQM research will say that the vacancy rate in the CBD is about 2.2% or thereabouts, and there are methods of about over 3 weeks of consecutive vacancy or advertised for rent. Talk to the leasing agents and they'll tell you their rent roll is about 0.5 to 1% in those inner areas, and that's because they start listing it 4 to 6 weeks before it's even been vacated. So different methodologies there, and you're getting different results, but you're getting definitely an expectation from people. Students will rent anything, they'll rent this cupboard as long as there's a tram out the door or a uni around the corner. They're out all the time doing all the things that we wish we were doing all the time. Young professionals in your families, they've got higher expectations now. It's not how much are they willing to pay extra for the amenity in the building, it's where is the amenity in the building. So it's not necessarily prepared to pay as much as it is. Their expectations of renting have grown. There are more people renting, they're renting for longer, they want to make it a good place to live, and it's not I'll be gone by the time I'm 25 anymore. It might be, hopefully I'm gone at some point. So a lot of things driving that rental market. Still consistent demand underpinning it, and I suppose we don't really know about the unoccupied dwelling volume, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So the difference between a rental vacancy and an unoccupied dwelling, if you follow, I'm sure you do. But I'll come back to that in a second. Now, so what does this all do to the supply and demand balance? So, we talked about those big numbers a little bit earlier on, and we sort of forget that 93,000 apartments in that area, total possible future supply, sounds big. That same area has a current population of a little over 450,000, and is, if you take forecast ID numbers, expected to grow to about 691,000 in the next 20 years. 236,000 additional residents. Even I think a reasonable household size assumption of about 2 per dwelling leads you to a requirement of additional 5,600 per annum. Now that's just assuming that the demographers have got that right for that specific area. It doesn't take into account what additional proportion you could attract from Greater Melbourne's demand. So some of this is based on historic trends, but how do we know that we can't attract a greater share of the requirement for 36,500 dwellings that we're assuming for Greater Melbourne, doubling the size of the city in the next 35 or so years. So, it's a few things to play with, but let's put this into context against supply. This chart is essentially trying to take those supply numbers and relate it to the dwelling requirements each year and work out how many years does it take to exhaust that supply on the basis of that underlying demand. And there are a couple of different scenarios here. So let's start with, we take the 93,000, so that's everything that's under construction right now, in pre-sales, approved and in application. That's your big one. So your worst case scenario is you're talking about 16 odd years to absorb all of that. That seems like that's a reasonably long time, and depending when that gets delivered, it could be quite problematic for various people when you're up against competition. Now, take away the application, because we don't really know what that is. Let's relate it to something that's a bit firmer, it's more certain in its arrival and timing. Not to say some of those approvals won't lapse or change. Of course they will. But just for a bit of context, you're talking about 10 years under those circumstances. And then if we come back to that third scenario where you just look in the short term and say, all right, everything under construction and pre-sales, it's basically about 5 years, which when you think about how long it takes to sell, to build, everything else, it's actually not that far off a natural balance between that underlying demand, in a theoretical sense, acknowledge that, and the scale and reasonable timing to deliver that. Now we'll overlay another scenario to those scenarios, and excuse my tongue twister, but okay, let's take some of the prevailing conditions. The confidence impact of the current climate where people are being put off settlements, affecting people's confidence in the market generally. And we say, for argument's sake, all right, 100% of projects under construction will settle, 90% of those in pre-seed sales will, 80% of those in approval will, and 70% of those in application will, just for argument's sake. And then it brings it down even further. So you come back to, particularly affects the big scenarios where you come back to 13 and a half years of demand being satisfied by that supply. Come back to about 9 years here, and you're not as affected here because you're assuming that most of that's pretty locked away and will happen. You might argue that some of that gets knocked back a bit too with projects being delayed by the current sales confidence and so on. But what this does is it just sort of highlights how different this supply and demand balance is depending on which lens you look through, and also being realistic about that 93,000 apartments, that last 100, they're not going to get delivered if everything else has been flushed down the drain. So we're oversimplifying it in the media and saying one snapshot in time on supply is going to come forward and we're flooded and how can we possibly fill it? It's just not how it works. So I just find this to be quite an interesting bit of context to relate to, and you might say you're just talking rubbish, and that's fine. But I found it interesting just to look at it in those terms, and particularly in that short-term liquidity issues that we're having here. These will get pushed back and reduced. They roll over. That's what happens. And again, like I said earlier, you have the prospect of attracting a greater share of the Greater Melbourne demand. If we're going to be continuing to be driven by interstate and international immigration, who's to say where they will live? Depending where they're coming from, they will have different expectations. Perhaps in the past there wasn't the same choice of dwelling, and I think there should be choice and affordability of dwelling. You shouldn't have to live 50 k's out, and you shouldn't have to live in an overly expensive house for $1,500 a week in Armadale. It's something worth doing, but it's it's about choice and affordability for me. So I did apologise about the nautical terms, but this changed quite late in the day when I realised what I'd done throughout the rest of the presentation. So, taking all these swirling bits of waves and weather that we're in amongst, and trying to understand what will happen. How do we survive until the lifeboat comes or whatever. I'm so sorry. I'm just going to.
You are.
No, I'm not. You called it. So navigating the horizon. Here we go, and that's me rowing.
Where's Pie?
Where's your tiger?
Yeah, good question. I ate it. What do we need to do in the short term to overcome some of these challenges? And we've heard from current surveys we're doing. Our next edition of the Essentials will be out in the next few weeks. But the people that are responding to us now are saying, on paper it looks like we've made 2 sales, but we've actually made about 30 sales, but got rid of 28 somewhere else and cycling through and swapping them over. So there's a bit of replacing greater caution in accepting and vetting curb sales. And the second one, this one's a classic.
Where that is all I say.
Oh, honestly, there's a valuer in our office called Todd, and he's a big guy. He's bought an apartment in Richmond, and he was telling me that he got the valuation for his apartment. I've asked him every week because I know how desperate he's been to get the keys. Like, you know, have you got the keys yet? He's finally settling the thing, and the value has come in at, you know, typically quite well below his purchase price, and he's gone back and outvalued the valuer. So you haven't taken into account these sales of, you know, virtually the identical apartment, you know, round the corner, everything else. And he said, just, I know you've spent 20 minutes on it because this is your job and it's $200 and everything else, but, you know, just do me a favour. I've given you the evidence, consider it, and it came back up to the purchase price. But, you know, I mentioned he's a big guy, but I'm pretty sure it's because of his homework. But you just think, you know, there's a lot of downward pressure on valuation because of the supply, because of the risk profile of lenders and so on. Perhaps some of you can talk about this afterwards. But you know, some of it does come back to giving things time and consideration and thinking beyond your limitations and spending 20 minutes on it. So, you know, that's my lesson from Todd, was educate the valuer. The other interesting thing is, you know, maybe we accept new models. Maybe we look to the US, the multifamily model, and we say, all right, we won't necessarily take the profit in the short term. We'll roll it up later on and do it a bit differently. And rental market's holding up. Maybe we'll create a different product. Maybe it's something that has legs here. From what I've seen, that we haven't seen much of it here. I think people have played around at it, but you know, there seems to be a lot of interest in it. Everyone I talk to is sort of asking the question, is whether someone actually makes the leap and runs with it and attracts the funds. I think it'll be attractive to people. You know, people like the stability and income profile of residential, and they like Australia, and it's in some ways mitigating some of that short-term risk. So it sort of seems like it might be something to think about. The other thing is, everybody and their dog is coming to Urbis and asking about, I'd really like a site in an affluent sort of middle ring suburb. Hasn't really bolted yet in terms of the acquisition costs. You know, not necessarily under the same restrictive zone elsewhere.
Fairyland.
Yeah, yeah. No, honestly, and so yeah, it seems great. It's a great idea. But everybody's been trying to move down that risk curve, and I think you're just getting there's clients now that have got super towers going on in the CBD, but they're also looking at the 50 to 100 development, 15, 20, 25 Ks from the CBD. So yeah, they're sort of getting onto it early and trying to find the best sites, and you know, those areas that have either the profile now, or they're taking a punt and saying, all right, I can get some income here and sit on this for 10, 15 years and you know, maybe off a commercial lease and see what happens. I'm sure a lot of you in this room are doing this every day, but you know, it was just amazing from, you know, a period late last year where suddenly everyone was just like, oh, I want something in the CBD and documents, this, that, the other, and then it was just like, oh, we want something in Box Hill, Doncaster, in anywhere. Like it's, and townhouses just seem to be pretty hot right now. So, like I said earlier, you know, let's see who's going to bridge this gap, who's going to take this opportunity, this risky and wonderful opportunity, and fill this funding gap and let people have their apartments. You know, I've spoken to a few people who think they're close. I won't name names, but if they think they can do something that's closer to the original lending rates that were agreed, and that will perhaps get more people over the line in the next couple of months and years. So yeah, let's keep an eye on that, and let's have a cocktail or a drink or a mint or whatever you like. So, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
I'm sure much of it is old news to you.